Jesse Caldwell didn't move for a man unless that man gave him reason. He'd lived 3 years on that mountain without giving a damn about what happened below it. But the afternoon he walked into the Copper Creek Saloon and heard a man put a price on his own child, $20, like she was a lame mule, something deep in Jesse's chest cracked open. Something he'd thought the mountain had already killed. He set down his glass. He reached into his coat. And he did the only thing a man with nothing left to lose ever really does. He paid. If that stopped you cold, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Jesse and Lucy's story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Jesse Caldwell hadn't planned on saving anybody that day. He'd come down from the high country the same way he did on the first Thursday of every month. Quiet, purposeful, and gone before noon. Pick up flour, salt, maybe a pound of coffee if Harlan at the dry goods hadn't raised his prices again. That was the full extent of it. That was enough. He tied his horse outside the Copper Creek Saloon because it was the only place in town with a water trough that wasn't bone dry in August, and because Harlan's boy had told him the flour shipment wouldn't roll in until after 3. He wasn't there to drink. He hadn't touched whiskey in 3 years, not since the winter he'd stood over 2 graves in frozen ground and decided the bottle wasn't any kind of company he needed. He was there because a man had to put himself somewhere while he waited, and the saloon was at least cooler than the street. He ordered water. Cleet, the bartender, a heavy-set man who'd known Jesse going on 6 years, slid it across the bar without comment. That was the kind of relationship Jesse had with most of Copper Creek. They knew better than to push conversation on him, and in return, he didn't push back against the world. It was a fair arrangement. He might have been out the door in 20 minutes, maybe less. Then Hank Briggs started talking. Hank Briggs was the kind of man a town collected the way a barn collected rats. Nobody wanted him, but he kept showing up. He owed money to half the merchants on Main Street, drank through whatever he earned before he earned it, and had a particular talent for making decent men feel dirty just by being in their vicinity. He was 3 drinks past loud when Jesse walked in, sitting at a corner table with 2 men Jesse didn't recognize. Trail dirty, sharp-eyed in the way that men are sharp-eyed when they're always looking for the angle. And standing just behind Hank's chair, close enough that her shadow fell across his shoulder, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 11, maybe 12 on a generous count. She had her arms crossed tight across her chest, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. And her eyes, pale gray, almost colorless in the saloon's dim light, were fixed somewhere on the floor about 3 feet in front of her. Not looking at anything, not looking at anyone, just waiting, the way a person waits when they've already decided the outcome, and there's nothing left to do but stand there and let it happen to them. Jesse knew that look. God help him, he knew it from the inside. $20, Hank was saying, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once been told no hard enough to stick. That's a fair price. She's quiet, she's strong enough to work, and she don't eat much. $20 and she's yours till she's grown, or till you're done with her, whichever comes first. One of the trail men tilted his head and looked the girl over the way a man looks at livestock he isn't sure about.
How do we know she ain't gonna bolt the first chance she gets?
Hank waved a hand. She's got nowhere to go. Mother's dead. Don't know nobody in this county. She'll do what she's told. The second man's eyes moved over her with an expression that made the muscles across Jesse's back go rigid. 15, the man said, on account of her being so scrawny. 18, Hank countered, and that's my final 20. The word came out of Jesse's mouth before his brain had weighed in on the matter. Every head in that corner of the saloon turned. Hank Briggs squinted across the room. The two trailmen went very still, in the way that men go still when they haven't decided yet whether to be annoyed or afraid. Jesse set his water glass down on the bar. He crossed the room slowly, the way he moved through country where he didn't know what might be hiding in the brush. His boots were quiet on the planked floor. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked at Hank Briggs without any particular expression on his face. "I said 20, Jesse repeated, "and I won't be negotiating." Hank stared up at him. Jesse Caldwell wasn't the largest man in Copper Creek, not the broadest through the shoulder, not the tallest. But there was something about the way he stood, hands loose at his sides, that had a way of making men recalculate. Hank had seen Jesse put a rifle ball through a fence post at 400 yards once, just to settle an argument someone else had started. He was remembering that now. "Caldwell," Hank said carefully, "this here's a private arrangement." "Not anymore, it ain't." Jesse reached into the inside pocket of his coat, counted out $20 in worn bills, and laid them flat on the table. He didn't look at the money again. He kept his eyes on Hank. "Take it. Walk away. And if I ever hear your name connected to a transaction like this one again, I'll make sure the marshal over in Silver Falls hears every detail. You understand me?" One of the trailmen shifted in his seat. "You got no right coming in here and—" "I just bought the right," Jesse said, and looked at the man with an evenness that left no room for argument. "You want to debate it? I'm happy to step outside." A beat of silence moved around the table like a cold draft. Neither man moved. Hank stared at the bills. He stared at Jesse. He picked up the money and shoved it in his vest pocket without another word. "She ain't worth the trouble," Hank muttered, mostly to his drink. "You'll see." Jesse didn't respond to that. He turned to the girl. She hadn't moved. Arms still crossed, eyes still aimed at the floor. Up close, he could see that her dress had been mended so many times in so many places, it barely remembered its original form. Her hair was braided but coming loose on one side, and there was a bruise along her left jawline, greenish and fading, old enough to be healing, but not old enough to be gone. Jesse crouched slightly, so he wasn't looking down at her from his full height. "My name is Jesse," he said, and kept his voice as level as he knew how. "I'm not going to hurt you. I need you to understand that first, before anything else." She didn't look up. "You got a name?" he asked. A pause, long enough that he wondered if she'd answer at all. Then, barely above a whisper, "Lucy." "All right, Lucy," he straightened. "You don't have to go anywhere with me if you don't want to, but I'd strongly advise you not to stay here." Her eyes finally came up. They were steadier than he'd expected. A child's eyes, set in a face that had already seen more than a child's face ought to hold. "You're the same as him," she said. Flat, no accusation in it, just a statement of what she understood the world to be. "You paid for me." The words found a gap in his ribs and went straight through. "I paid to keep those other men from having you," Jesse said. "That's a different thing." "How?" He didn't have a quick answer. There probably wasn't one. "Because I'm asking you to come with me instead of ordering you to. And because the moment we figure out where you want to go, I'll take you there." She looked at him. She looked back at Hank, who was already signaling Cleet for another drink and paying them no mind whatsoever. She looked at Jesse again. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go." Cleet was wiping down the bar when Jesse walked past with the girl at his side. He called after them without looking up. "You know what you're getting into, Caldwell?" "Not even a little bit," Jesse said, and pushed through the saloon doors into the hard August sun. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Crow that Jesse had raised from a colt, shifted and blew air through his nose when they came off the boardwalk. Lucy stopped a few feet away and looked at the animal with an expression Jessie had seen before on people who'd learned to stop wanting things. A careful distance that used to be something warmer. "You ride?" Jessie asked, untying the reins. "No." "You'll sit up front. Hold the saddle horn. He won't do anything stupid." She squinted up at the horse. "How do you know?" "Because I told him not to." Jessie lifted her up into the saddle before she could reconsider, and she grabbed the horn with both hands and held on white-knuckled while he swung up behind her. "You're all right," he said. "I've got you." She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't let go of the horn either. They left Copper Creek heading northwest, up into the high country. Jessie could feel the town's eyes on his back the whole length of Main Street. He'd given people something to chew on today, that was certain. A mountain hermit coming down to buy a child off a drunk gambler. By sundown, the story would be 6 different things to 6 different people, and none of them would be entirely true. He didn't much care. He'd stopped caring what Copper Creek thought about him a long time ago. They were a mile out of town, climbing through pine shade, before Lucy spoke again. "Where are we going?" "My place, up in the mountains. Couple hours ride." She absorbed that. Then, "Is there anybody else there?" "No." The trail wound upward through switchbacks, the summer heat falling away as they climbed. Crow moved steady and unhurried, his hooves finding the path without being told. "Are you going to sell me again?" she asked. The question was completely level, no trembling edge to it, just a request for information, delivered by someone who had gotten very good at asking the questions that mattered, before the answer came in a form she couldn't do anything about. Jessie felt something shift in his throat. "No." "People say that." "I reckon they do." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I can't make you trust me, Lucy. That's not something I can do for you. I'm just telling you what I know to be true." "Why did you buy me?" He thought about it longer than she probably expected. Long enough that Crow picked his way around a switchback, and the pine canopy thickened above them, and a hawk called once from somewhere up the ridge. "Because nobody ought to be sold," Jessie finally said. "Not for $20. Not for any amount. Not ever." "But you paid it anyway." "Yeah," he exhaled slow. "I did." "So you own me." "No." It came out sharper than he intended. He pulled it back. "No. Handing $20 to a drunk doesn't make a person property, no matter what that drunk believes. You're not mine, Lucy. You belong to yourself." She was quiet a moment. "My father didn't think so." "Your father was wrong." She turned her head, just slightly, just enough that he could see the edge of her profile, and then looked back at the trail. She didn't speak again for a long stretch, but something in the way she was sitting in the saddle changed. Not relaxing exactly, more like a thing that had been braced for impact, deciding, cautiously, to unbrace just a little. They reached the cabin as the afternoon sun began its long summer lean toward the ridgeline. Jessie helped her down from Crow. She stood in the dirt yard and looked at the cabin. Rough log walls, a covered porch with a single chair, a woodpile stacked taller than either of them, with an expression he couldn't quite place. "It ain't much," Jessie said. "It has walls," Lucy said. He looked at her sideways. "That an improvement?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. He unsaddled Crow and turned him into the small fenced pasture east of the cabin, then came back to find her standing exactly where he'd left her. "You can go inside," he said. "Door's not locked. Never has been." She walked up the porch steps carefully, testing each one. She pushed the door open, looked in, but didn't cross the threshold right away.
Jessie came up behind her and looked over her head into the single room. The stone fireplace, the rough-built table with 2 chairs, the single bunk against the far wall, the shelves of supplies along the back. Plain. Functional. A place built for surviving winter, not for living in. "It's 1 room," Lucy said. "I'll rig up a curtain for your corner, give you some privacy. Tonight you take the bunk and I'll sleep on the floor." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." She held his gaze for a beat, those pale gray eyes measuring something she hadn't yet made up her mind about. And then she went inside. He made a fire, even though August didn't call for one, because building it gave his hands something to do besides think. He put together biscuits and salt pork, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and set 2 plates on the table without asking whether she was hungry. She sat across from him and ate methodically, the way people eat when they've learned not to trust that the plate will still be there if they pause to appreciate it. She ate everything. Jessie poured her coffee without asking, added 3 spoons of sugar without being told, because she looked like a person who needed something sweet and probably hadn't had any in a long time. She wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes." "Always?" Jessie set his fork down, then picked it back up. "No," he said, "not always." She heard what he didn't say. "They die?" "Yeah." She nodded, slow, like it was information she already knew how to file. "My mother died 2 years back," she said. "After that, my father—" She stopped, looked at her coffee. "After that, I was mostly in the way." Jessie's jaw tightened. "You weren't in the way," he said, keeping his voice even by effort. "He just wasn't man enough to do right by you. That's his failing, Lucy, not yours. Don't you ever carry that as your own." "You don't know him." "No, but I know what a man who does right by his child looks like, and selling her to strangers for $20 ain't any part of it." Her hands tightened around the mug. She didn't respond. The fire popped. Outside, the long mountain evening was settling in, the sky turning the color of old copper above the ridgeline. "What's going to happen to me?" she finally asked. Jessie leaned back in his chair and took a long breath. "That's partly up to you. There's a woman in Copper Creek, Mrs. Hargrove, runs the schoolhouse, who might be able to find you a proper placement with a family. And there are folks over in Meridian who take in—" "I don't want to go to strangers," she said, fast, hard, like a door slamming shut. Jessie was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said carefully. "Then we figure out something else." She looked up at him. "You'd let me stay here?" "I wouldn't send you away." "That's not the same thing." He met her eyes, those old young eyes that had stopped expecting the world to be gentle and were just trying to identify, one person at a time, whether it was dangerous. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Thomas, who had been 4 years old when the fever took him, who had died with his small hand wrapped around Jessie's finger, and how that hand going slack had been the moment Jessie Caldwell had decided, deep down in some wordless part of himself, that the safest thing he could do for the rest of his life was not let anything in again. "You can stay, Lucy," Jessie said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "For as long as you need to." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back down at her coffee mug. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything at all. But her shoulders dropped, just barely, just an inch, in the way shoulders do when a person puts down something they've been hauling alone for longer than they can remember. Later, after she'd taken the bunk and he'd rolled out his bedroll on the floor,
Jessie lay in the dark and listened to her breathe, slow and steady, the way children breathe when they finally run out of room to be afraid. He stared at the log ceiling. The fire had burned down to coals, throwing a low red glow across the room. $20. He'd handed $20 to a man who didn't deserve to hold it, for a girl who hadn't deserved a single thing that had been done to her. And now she was here, breathing softly 10 feet away in his bunk. And Jesse Caldwell, who had spent 3 years turning himself into something that didn't need anything or anyone, had absolutely no idea what came next. Crows shifted in the pasture outside. A nightbird called once from the tree line and went silent. Jesse pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stared at the ceiling, and held very, very still. He hadn't cried since the day he buried Thomas. He hadn't let himself. There was a version of grief that could kill a man if he opened the door to it, and Jesse had learned to keep that door shut through sheer, grinding will. But lying there in the dark, listening to a broken girl breathe like she was finally, cautiously allowing herself to sleep, the door shuddered on its hinges. It was the closest thing to hope he'd felt in 3 years. That scared him more than anything else that had happened today. Morning came hard and fast, the way it always does in the high country. No slow creep, just darkness and then light. Like the mountain decided overnight it was done waiting. Jesse was already up. He'd barely slept. Not because the floor was uncomfortable, he'd slept on worse, but because every time he started to drift, he'd hear Lucy shift in the bunk, or catch the sound of her breath catching in some half-dreamed place, and he'd go rigid all over again, listening for something he couldn't name. He had coffee going and biscuits in the pan by the time she stirred. She sat up in the bunk and looked at him across the room, with the particular wariness of a person who goes to sleep in one situation and has to relearn every single morning that it's real, that it happened, that they're here. Jesse kept his eyes on the pan. "Morning. Coffee's ready when you want it." She didn't say anything right away. He heard her feet hit the floor, heard her cross to the door and pull it open. He heard her step out onto the porch, and he heard her stop. He gave her a minute. She came back in and sat down at the table. He poured her coffee. 3 spoons of sugar, same as the night before. "Thank you," she said, quiet, like the words cost her something. "You're welcome." They ate without much talking. Jesse watched her from the corner of his eye without making it obvious. She'd slept in her clothes, which he'd expected. Her braid had come completely undone overnight, and her hair hung loose around her face, and she kept pushing it back with one hand while she ate with the other, irritated by it, but not doing anything about it. She ate like she had the night before, fast, efficient, not wasteful. Cleaned the plate. "I'm going to check the fence line this morning," Jesse said, setting down his mug. "You can come or you can stay. Up to you." She looked at him. "What would I do if I stayed?" "Whatever you wanted." She seemed to find that concept genuinely puzzling. "Like what?" "There's books on that shelf. Dried beans that need sorting. Crow'll take carrots if you want to bring him some from the crate by the door." He paused. "Or you could sit on the porch and do nothing at all. That's a choice, too." Lucy looked at the shelf, looked at the door, looked back at him. "I'll come," she said. She was quiet on the fence line, but it was a different kind of quiet than the day before. Less like a held breath, more like a person paying attention. Jesse worked, and she walked alongside him, watching what he did and how he did it. And after a while she started handing him tools before he reached for them. Not every time, but often enough that he noticed. Smart kid, observant. The kind of quiet that comes from spending a long time in situations where you had to read people fast. They were working on a post that had come loose from the ground when she said, without looking at him, "You had a daughter." Jesse's hands didn't stop. "Yeah." "How old?" "4, when she passed." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "What was her name?" "Clara." He set the post, packed the dirt around the base. "She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, almost black. Used to look at everything like she was deciding whether it was worth her time." Lucy handed him the hammer without being asked. "She sounds like she was serious." She was, 4 years old and already had more opinions than most adults I've known. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to stop. "She'd have told you exactly what she thought of you inside of 10 minutes, whether you wanted her to or not." "That sounds annoying," Lucy said. Jesse looked up sharply, and then he heard it. Just the faintest edge of something in her voice. Not quite a joke, but the skeleton of one. "It was," he said. "It was also the best thing in my life." Lucy looked down at the fence post. "I'm sorry she died." "Me too." She handed him the next nail without being told. He took it. They kept working. It was on the way back to the cabin that it happened. Lucy had been walking a step ahead of him, picking her way along the trail, when her foot caught on a root and she pitched forward. Jesse caught her by the arm before she hit the ground, a fast grip, solid, and pulled her upright. She didn't make a sound, but she wrenched her arm back so hard she nearly fell again, spinning to put distance between them, both hands up, eyes wide, chest heaving. Jesse went absolutely still. "Okay," he said quietly, hands open at his sides, not reaching, not moving. "Okay, I've got you." "Don't—" She stopped. Her voice had gone ragged in a way it hadn't before. Her eyes were locked on him with a raw, animal alertness that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with what she'd learned hands felt like before he'd been the one holding them. "I'm not going to grab you," Jesse said, same tone he'd use with a spooked horse, even and low, and offering nothing to push against. "I caught you so you wouldn't fall. That's all it was." She stood there breathing hard, shoulders drawn up, eyes not quite believing him yet. "I will never put hands on you to hurt you," he said. "Not ever. But if that's not something you believe right now, that's all right. I'll wait." The wild look in her eyes didn't disappear, but it shifted, just slightly, like something backing away from the edge. She lowered her hand slowly. "He used to grab my arm," she said, and her voice was flat and factual and completely devastating. "When he thought I'd done something wrong." Jesse's teeth came together behind his closed mouth. He kept his expression still by effort. "Hank?" he asked, though he already knew it wasn't just Hank. "My father." She crossed her arms across her chest. That same old gesture, the same armor. "Before my mother died, he didn't. After—" She stopped, started again. "After, it was different." "Lucy." He waited until she looked at him. "Nobody here is going to grab your arm. Not ever. And if I reach for you, I'll tell you first. All right?" She studied him, that careful, measuring look that he was beginning to understand was the most honest thing about her. The way she didn't look away from things, didn't pretty them up, just stared straight at the heart of something until she'd figured out whether it was a threat. "All right," she said finally. They walked back to the cabin, 3 feet of space between them the whole way. But she didn't drop any further back. The first real crack came 4 days in. Jesse woke to the sound of something hitting the floor and was on his feet before he was fully awake. And Lucy was standing in the middle of the room, in the dark, shaking, both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes open and terrified, and aimed at something that wasn't in the room with them. He didn't touch her. He crouched to her level and said, "Hey, you're here. You're in the cabin. Nothing's wrong." She blinked, focused on him, and then she sat down hard on the floor, like her legs had simply stopped working, and she pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her forehead against them and made one sound, one single sound, like something tearing, before she went quiet again. Jessie sat down on the floor across from her and waited. After a long time, she said, "He was selling me again. In the dream." "Yeah?" "And nobody stopped him. There were all these people and nobody—" She pressed her mouth against her knee. "Nobody cared." "I cared," Jessie said. She lifted her head. "You weren't there. In the dream, you weren't there." "I'm here now." She stared at him across the dark room, something fragile and fierce doing battle behind her eyes. "What if you go away?" Jessie's chest did something complicated. He thought about all the honest, careful ways he could answer that. All the responsible ways a man tells a child not to put her hopes in any one place, because nothing in this world is permanent. He'd learned that lesson himself, had it taught to him in the hardest possible way. He looked at Lucy, this girl who had been sold for $20, and who flinched at sudden movement, and who handed him tools before he asked for them, and who had told him, flat and factual, that her father had been different after her mother died. He looked at her, and all the responsible answers fell away. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her forehead back against her knees. "Okay," she said. She was asleep again in 10 minutes, back in the bunk, curled on her side with her hands tucked under her face. Jessie sat on the floor a while longer and stared at the coals and thought about the things you say to a broken child in the dark, and whether the saying of them makes them true. He decided they did. He decided you made them true by saying them, and then you spent the rest of your days making sure you were right. It was on the 6th morning that Lucy asked about Sarah. She'd found the photograph. It was on the shelf between the Harper's Almanac and the tin of spare candles, small and oval in its dark wood frame. Jessie came back from watering Crow to find her holding it in both hands, looking at it with an expression he couldn't read. He stopped in the doorway. "Is this her?" Lucy asked. She didn't startle, didn't hide it, just held it out toward him, an honest question in her face. Jessie took the photograph and looked at it for the first time in, he didn't know how long. He'd stopped counting that kind of thing. Sarah, in her good dress, hair done up the way she'd worn it on Sundays, one hand resting on the back of the chair beside her, because the photographer had told her to, and she'd thought it looked stiff and formal, and had said so, and Jessie had laughed, and she'd been smiling when the shutter came down. "Her name was Sarah," he said. Lucy sat down at the table. "Tell me about her." It wasn't a demand. It was offered softly, like something small held out in an open palm. And Jessie felt the full weight of it, the trust it took for a child who'd been hurt to ask a man with sad eyes to open a door he'd been keeping shut. He sat down across from her. He set the photograph between them. "She was stubborn," he said. "Smart as hell and not shy about it. Could read weather better than any man I knew. Look at a sky and tell you exactly what it was going to do by nightfall, and she was right more often than not." Lucy looked at the photograph. "She's pretty." She was beautiful. He said it simply. Inside and out. The kind of woman who made whatever room she was in feel warmer. "Did she like it here? On the mountain?" Jessie turned the photograph slightly toward himself. She loved it. Said it was the only place she'd ever been where the sky felt close enough to touch. He paused. She'd have liked you." Lucy looked up at him. "Why?" "Because you don't flinch from hard things. You face them. She respected that in people." Lucy was quiet. She looked back at the photograph. "Do you miss her every day?" she asked. "Yes," Jesse said. No hesitation. "Does it get smaller, the missing?" He thought about lying, thought about the kind thing to say, the reassuring thing. Then he thought about how this girl had been given nothing but soft words that turned out to be wrong, and he decided she deserved the honest ones. "It doesn't get smaller," he said. "You just get bigger around it. It stops taking up all the room." Lucy turned that over in her mind like a stone in her palm. "My mother's been gone 2 years," she said. "I still think I see her sometimes, out of the corner of my eye." "That doesn't go away either." "But it's not terrible, eventually?" He looked at her. "No," he said quietly. "Eventually, it's not terrible. Eventually, it's almost like company." She picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long moment, then set it back between them. "I think I'd have liked her too," she said. Jesse didn't say anything. He pressed his palms flat on the table and breathed. The trouble came on the 8th day. Jesse had ridden down to Copper Creek for supplies, leaving Lucy at the cabin with Crow in the pasture, and instructions to bar the door if anyone came she didn't know, which she'd agreed to with an eye roll that surprised a short laugh out of him. And he'd barely made it to Harlan's Dry Goods before the mood of the place told him something was wrong. Harlan himself was the one who told him. "There's talk," the old man said, sliding Jesse's flour across the counter without meeting his eyes. "About the girl." Jesse's hands went still on the counter. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that starts with Hank Briggs and ends badly." Harlan glanced toward the window. "He's telling anybody who'll listen that you took his daughter." "She's not his daughter." "Jesse." Harlan looked at him fully now, and there was worry in the old man's eyes, plain and unguarded. "He doesn't say that." "He's in the saloon right now, spinning a story about how you came in and took his girl by force, and he wants her back." The temperature of Jesse's blood dropped about 10 degrees. "She is not his daughter," he said again, and his voice had gone flat and careful, the way it went when he was working very hard at staying still. "I know that. Most people with sense know that. But Jake Hollis is in town." Harlan said the name like it meant something. "You know who Jake Hollis is?" Jesse knew. Everybody in the county knew. Jake Hollis ran a land office in Silver Falls and had the local judge in his pocket so deep the man had to brush Hollis's name off his coat every morning. Hollis made his money acquiring things that weren't rightfully his: land, contracts, settlements, and he had a talent for finding the legal angle on even the most twisted situation. "What does Jake Hollis have to do with Lucy?" Jesse asked. Harlan's expression told him the answer before the words came out. "Hank Briggs went to him this morning, first thing. Before you came down off the mountain, Hank walked into Hollis's temporary office and signed something." Jesse waited. "Said he was establishing parental claim," Harlan said, "for the return of a minor child wrongfully removed from her guardian." The sound Jesse made was low and involuntary. Not quite a word, not quite anything else. "Jesse," Harlan leaned forward, "if Hollis backs that claim, you're looking at a formal complaint, possibly charges. The girl could be taken before you have time to get a proper lawyer." "She's 11 years old," Jesse said, and his voice had gone somewhere cold and quiet that didn't belong to this conversation at all. "He sold her in a saloon for $20. "I know that. In front of witnesses." "I know it. But Hollis is arguing she was placed in temporary care, his word, and the transaction was misconstrued." Harlan's jaw was tight. "He's good at this, Jesse. It's what he does."
Jesse picked up his flour. He picked up his coffee, his salt, his candles. He put the money on the counter and pushed it toward Harlan. "Where's Hollis now?" he asked. "Jesse, where?" Harlan closed his eyes briefly. "Hotel dining room, having his noon meal." Jake Hollis was a trim man in his 50s, with a careful face and clean hands. The kind of man who'd never done anything that could be directly proven, and who wore that record like a second suit. He was eating fried chicken and reading a paper when Jesse walked in. Jesse pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. Hollis looked up from his paper with an expression of mild annoyance that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes stayed calibrating, reading Jesse the way a man reads a hand of cards he hasn't decided whether to play or fold. "Mr. Caldwell," he said pleasantly, "I'd heard you might come looking for me." "Then you're already ahead," Jesse said. "I usually am." Hollis set his paper aside, folded his hands on the table. "I understand you've been looking after a young girl. That's very admirable. But the situation has become legally complicated." "The situation," Jesse said, "is that Hank Briggs tried to sell a child to two strangers in front of a dozen witnesses, and I bought her freedom instead. That's the situation." Hollis tilted his head. "What you describe as selling could just as easily be characterized as a temporary arrangement between a desperate father and parties willing to assist in her care. There are multiple interpretations. There's one truth. Truth is a remarkably slippery thing in court, Mr. Caldwell." Hollis picked up his fork. "I'd encourage you not to put too much faith in it as a legal strategy." Jesse leaned forward and put both forearms on the table. Not threatening, he didn't need to be. Just close enough that Hollis would have to work to ignore him. "That girl is not going back to Hank Briggs. You can file whatever you want. You can pull whatever string you own in Silver Falls. But she is not going back." Hollis looked at him steadily. Something moved in the careful face. Not quite respect, not quite interest. Something in between. "That kind of attachment," Hollis said slowly, "to a child you've known for barely more than a week." He paused. "That tells me you're not thinking clearly. And men who aren't thinking clearly make mistakes in adversarial proceedings." "And men who make their living preying on the vulnerable," Jesse said, "tend to underestimate what someone with nothing to lose is willing to do to protect the one thing they've got left." The words came out before he'd fully decided to say them, and the truth in them hit him at the same moment they hit Hollis. The one thing he had left. He hadn't said it out loud before, hadn't even let himself think it that directly. Hollis set his fork down. "I'll give you a week," he said, and his voice had shifted, not softer, but more considered, "to make whatever arrangements you believe are appropriate. After that, I'll be filing the paperwork." "A week," Jesse repeated. 7 days, Mr. Caldwell. I'd use them wisely." Jesse stood. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the edge of the table. He looked down at Jake Hollis, at his clean hands and his careful face and his paper and his fried chicken, and felt something settle into place in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. "Thank you for your time," Jesse said. He walked out of the hotel dining room and into the hard August sun, and stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and the weight of 7 days pressing down on him from all directions. 7 days. He had a child on a mountain who thought he wasn't going anywhere, and a man with a judge in his pocket who was going to try to prove him wrong. And the only thing Jesse Caldwell knew with absolute certainty, as he untied Crow from the rail and swung up into the saddle, was that he had meant every word he'd said in that dark cabin, in the middle of the night, to a girl with bad dreams. He wasn't going anywhere, which meant he had 7 days to figure out how to make that true. Jesse rode hard back up the mountain.
Not because urgency changed anything. Hollis had given him 7 days, and 7 days was what he had, no matter how fast Crow moved. He rode hard because he needed the wind in his face, and the ground moving under him, and something physical to push against. Because the alternative was sitting with the cold, specific terror of what he'd just been told. And that wasn't something he was ready to do yet. He got back to the cabin to find Lucy on the porch with Crow's spare bridle in her lap, working a cracked piece of leather with the small awl he kept in the tack box. She'd found it herself, figured out what needed doing, and started doing it without being asked. She looked up when he came into the yard, and something in his face told her immediately that the trip hadn't gone the way it should have. "What happened?" she said. He tied Crow to the post and unloaded the supplies. "Nothing you need to worry about right now." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He carried the flour inside. She followed him, still holding the bridle, and stood in the doorway while he stacked things on the shelf with more precision than the task required. "Jessie," he stopped, stood with his back to her, hands braced on the shelf. Took 1 breath. 2. Then he turned around. "Hank Briggs went to a lawyer this morning," he said. "Man named Jake Hollis. He's filing a legal claim to have you returned to Hank's custody." He watched her face. "I'm going to fight it. That's not in question. But I wanted you to know before you heard it some other way." Lucy stood very still in the doorway. "Returned to his custody," she repeated slowly, each word landing separately. "He sold me." "I know." "He stood in that saloon and put a price on me in front of everyone." "I know, Lucy. And a lawyer is going to stand in front of a judge and say, 'I belong with him'?" It wasn't a question. It was something darker, the specific, weary recognition of a child who had already learned that the world's rules had not been designed with her in mind. "A bad lawyer is going to try," Jessie said. "I'm going to find a better one." Her jaw was tight. Her eyes hadn't moved from his face. "And if you can't?" Jessie crossed the room and crouched in front of her, the same way he'd done in the saloon, so he wasn't looking down at her from his full height, and held her gaze. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he said. "That is still true. Whatever this turns into, you are not going back to Hank Briggs. I will stand in front of that judge myself and say every word that needs saying." Something moved through her face. Not relief, not quite. More like a person pressing a bruise to see if it still hurt. "People say things," she said quietly. "I know they do." He held her gaze. "I'm not most people, Lucy, and I've got nothing left to be afraid of losing. That makes me a dangerous man to go up against in a courtroom." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she held up the bridle. "The stitching came apart on the left side, too," she said. "Not just the crack." Jessie looked at the bridle, then at her. "Good eye," he said. She went back to the porch. He stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, listening to the soft, deliberate sound of her working the awl through leather, and felt something in his chest draw tight, and then, very slowly, release. He wrote letters that night, 3 of them, by firelight, at the rough table where he and Lucy ate their meals. He was not a man who wrote letters easily. Words on paper felt clumsy to him, like wearing boots on the wrong feet. But necessity has a way of making a man fluent in languages he'd otherwise avoid. The first went to a lawyer in Silver Falls named Ben Caldecott, who Jessie had met once at a property dispute 5 years back, and who had struck him as a man who actually read the law instead of just renting it out. The second went to Magistrate Harrow in Ridgefield, a man Jessie's neighbor Pete Dunbar had once described as the only judge in the county who Hollis hadn't managed to get his hooks into. The third went to Cleet, the bartender at the Copper Creek Saloon, asking him plainly whether he'd be willing to swear in writing to what he'd witnessed the day Jessie had walked in. Lucy had gone to bed an hour before. He could hear her breathing from across the room. Steady now. No nightmares tonight. He sealed the letters with the stub of wax he kept for the purpose and set them in a line on the shelf. And then he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands and stared at the ceiling. 7 days. In 7 days, Ben Caldecott might not even have received the letter yet, let alone replied. Magistrate Harrow was 3 days' ride from Copper Creek. Cleet would do what Cleet decided to do, and Jessie had no way to know what that was. What he had was a cabin on a mountain, a girl who was starting, barely, cautiously, to believe she might be safe, and a dead wife's photograph, and a man with clean hands who'd had this same dance with desperate people 100 times before, and knew all the steps. Jessie pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "You're not asleep." He dropped his hands. Lucy was sitting up in the bunk, watching him. "I thought you were," he said. "I was. Then I woke up." She pulled her knees to her chest. "You've been sitting there for a long time. Just thinking. About the lawyer? Among other things." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" Jessie thought about the easy answer, thought about the honest one. "A little," he said. She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already figured out. "Me too." He looked at her, this child in the dark, offering back to him the same bare honesty he'd given her. He thought of Clara, who had been 4 and fierce and full of opinions. He thought of Sarah, who had known bad weather by reading a sky. He thought of the photograph between the almanac and the candles, and the way a grief you'd carried alone for 3 years felt different when someone else knew you were carrying it. "We'll be all right," he said. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself." "Maybe I am," he admitted. "A little." That almost not quite smile crossed her face again. Just a flicker. Then she lay back down and pulled the blanket up and didn't say anything else. Jessie stayed at the table until the fire burned low. The first letter came back in 3 days. Not from Caldecott. Too soon for that. From Cleet. Pete Dunbar's oldest boy brought it up the mountain on his way through, trading the errand for a pound of Jessie's dried venison. And Jessie opened it at the fence line, with Lucy standing nearby, watching him read. Cleet's handwriting was the kind that suggested a man who'd learned his letters late and never fully forgave himself for it. Cramped and effortful, every word working hard just to make it onto the page. But the meaning was clear enough. "I saw the whole thing. I'll say so. You tell me where to say it." Jessie folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. "Good news?" Lucy asked. "Start of some," he said. It was Pete Dunbar himself who delivered the second piece. Pete ran a small cattle operation 2 miles down the valley, a gruff, plain-spoken man who'd known Jessie for 4 years and had never once offered an opinion on his choices, which Jessie had always considered Pete's finest quality. He rode up on the 5th day, with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that meant he'd thought hard about whether to come. "Heard about your situation," Pete said. "Word travels." "Always does." Pete turned his hat in his hands. "Hollis talked to 2 other men in town. Told them you'd—" He stopped, chose his words. "He's saying you've got the girl up here alone, and your intentions aren't what a decent man's ought to be." The air went out of Jessie's lungs. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood absolutely still, because if he started moving right then, he didn't know where he'd stop. That's what he's saying, Jesse said, and his voice came out with a quiet that was the most dangerous kind. I know it ain't true, Pete said quickly. I know you, Jesse. I know what kind of man you are. But Hollis is smart. He's not making a legal argument. He's making a town argument. Poisoning the water so that when it does go before a judge, there are already people who've heard the story his way. Jesse turned around and walked 3 steps away from Pete and stood with his back to him for a moment, doing the work of keeping his hands from shaking. He thought about Lucy inside the cabin right now, sorting beans the way he'd taught her, left to right, bad ones in the scrap bowl. He thought about what it meant that a man with clean hands was using her to build a case that would destroy every bit of careful trust she'd scraped together in the past 5 days. He turned back around. Who heard him say it? Pete listed 4 names. 3 of them Jesse knew, 2 ranchers and the postmaster's wife. The 4th was a name he didn't recognize. Clara Morton, Pete said. School teacher, new in town this spring. And Jessie, he paused. She didn't believe him. Jessie looked up. She said so, right there in front of Hollis and whoever else was standing around. Said she'd heard the true account from Harlan at the dry goods, and that spreading slander about a man trying to do right was a disgrace. Pete almost smiled. Hollis did not enjoy that. Jessie stood very still. Clara Morton. Widow. Came from somewhere east. She's boarding with the Hargroves. Pete settled his hat back on his head. She's been asking after you. She doesn't know me. No, but she knows the story, and she's angry on your behalf, which in my experience is a quality worth not wasting. Pete picked up his reins. I'm riding the Silver Falls day after tomorrow. I can carry any letters you've got. Jesse went inside and got 2 envelopes. One to Caldecott, a follow-up he'd written the night before, and a new one to Magistrate Harrow. He came back out and handed them to Pete. Thank you, Jesse said. Pete looked at him. Really looked at him. She settling in all right? The girl? Jesse thought about the bridle on the porch, about 3 spoons of sugar, about an almost smile in the dark. Yeah, he said. She is. Pete nodded once. Then he rode. He didn't tell Lucy what Hollis was saying. He told himself it was because she didn't need that particular weight added to what she was already carrying. He told himself that for about 2 hours before he admitted the real reason, which was that he didn't know how to look her in the eyes and explain that a man in town was using her existence to make him look like a monster. She found out on her own. He should have expected that. She was observant, and she was sharp, and she'd spent enough of her life reading rooms and reading people that she had antennae for things that were being kept from her. She noticed the shift in the way Jesse was moving around the cabin. A little too deliberate, a little too careful. And she noticed that he'd stopped mentioning town, and she noticed the particular way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. Like he was angry on her behalf at something he hadn't named. She waited until they were eating supper on the 6th evening. Then she set down her fork and said, "What is Hollis saying about you?" Jesse looked up. "I heard Pete Dunbar say slander when he thought I was out of earshot," she said. "I wasn't." Jesse set his own fork down. He told her. He kept it simple and plain and didn't try to soften any of the edges, because this girl had sharp edges of her own, and she'd earned the right not to be handled. He told her what Hollis was doing and why, and he watched her face go through a series of things. First the cold, recognizing kind of stillness, then something that looked like anger, then something harder to name. "He's using me," she said. "Yes. To make you look—" She stopped. Her jaw was very tight. "Lucy, I am so sick," she said, low and precise, "of men using me for things that have nothing to do with me." Jesse went quiet. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't be less than it deserved. She pushed back from the table and walked to the door and stood with her hand on the frame, looking out into the evening. And Jessie watched the line of her back, the rigid, furious, 11-year-old dignity of a girl who had been someone's excuse, and someone's property, and someone's burden, and had had enough. "Tell me what I can do," she said. Jessie blinked. "What?" She turned around. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "To help. Tell me what I can do. There has to be something." He looked at her, this child who'd been sold for $20 and had arrived at his cabin barely speaking and had spent 6 days learning to trust one person and was now standing at his door asking what she could do to fight the man who wanted to take it away. His throat was very tight. "There's a woman in town," he said carefully. "Clara Morton, schoolteacher. She stood up for us when Hollis was talking. She wants to help." He paused. "I was thinking of riding down to speak with her tomorrow." "You could come." Lucy looked at him. "Is that safe? I'll be with you." She turned it over. Then she nodded, once, firm. "Okay." She went back to the table and picked up her fork and finished her supper. And Jessie watched her eat with the same efficient, unsentimental thoroughness she brought to everything, and thought that Sarah would have liked her. He was more certain of that now than when he'd first said it. Clara Morton was waiting on the Hargroves' front porch when Jessie and Lucy rode into Copper Creek the next morning, which told him Pete Dunbar had gotten word to her somehow. She was a compact woman, somewhere in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who spent a lot of time in rooms full of children. A stillness that was actually a form of very focused attention. She came down the porch steps and looked at Lucy first, not at Jessie, at Lucy. "You must be Lucy," she said. Her voice was direct and warm in equal measure. "I'm Clara. I've been very much looking forward to meeting you." Lucy looked at her with the careful, measuring look she gave everyone. "Why?" Clara didn't miss a beat. "Because you're the bravest person in this county, and I think you should know that somebody outside this mountain thinks so." Something moved across Lucy's face, a flicker, quickly controlled, of something she wasn't ready to let all the way out. "I'm not brave," she said. "You're here," Clara said simply. "That's brave enough." Jessie stood slightly back and let them find their footing, watching the way Clara spoke to Lucy, not above her, not around her, but straight at her, and felt something he recognized as gratitude settle quiet and solid in his chest. When Clara finally looked at him, there was a question in her eyes that she was keeping politely to herself. "Caldecott wrote back," she said, and produced a letter from her coat pocket. "He sent it to me. Pete told him I'd been asking after the situation. He says he can be here Thursday." Thursday was 2 days away. Jessie let out a long, slow breath. "He also says," Clara continued, and her voice dropped just slightly, "that he knows Judge Harrow personally, and that Harrow has been looking for a reason to investigate Hollis's arrangement with the Silver Falls court for the better part of a year." Jessie went very still. "This case," Clara said carefully, "could be more than just Lucy. If it goes the way Caldecott thinks it might, if Hollis overplays his hand, it could crack open everything he's built in this county." Jessie looked at the letter. He looked at Lucy, who was listening with her arms crossed in that old familiar way. But her chin was up, not defensive, not hunching. Her chin was up and her eyes were steady. "That means Hollis will fight harder," Jessie said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "It does. And he knows it too, which means he may not wait until the 7th day." Clara's expression confirmed what he already suspected. "He filed this morning," she said. "The hearing is Friday." Jessie's jaw went tight. 2 days, not 7. Hollis had moved up the clock the moment he'd realized the game had shifted. He reached into his coat and produced the envelope he'd written on the trail down. The one that listed every witness he could name, every date, every conversation. He handed it to Clara.
"Can you get this to Caldecott tonight?" he asked. "Already planned on it," she said. Jesse looked at Lucy. She was watching him with those pale gray eyes, the ones that looked at hard things directly and didn't apologize for it. He thought about what he'd told her in the dark. He thought about what he'd told her at the supper table. He thought about what he'd told Pete Dunbar without even fully meaning to. She is settling in. She is learning to trust. She is the one thing he had left, and he had meant it without even knowing he was saying it. And now, Friday was 2 days away, and Jake Hollis had clean hands and a judge who owed him, and every legal maneuver in the book. And Jesse Caldwell had a bartender's letter, a school teacher's courage, a lawyer who was 2 days out, and a girl with her chin up. "Lucy," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever happens Friday," he said, "I need you to know something." She waited. "The last week," he said, and his voice was coming out with more difficulty than he expected, "has been the first week in 3 years I haven't woken up and wished I was still asleep." He held her eyes. "That's because of you, and I don't care what Jake Hollis has in his pocket or whose name is on whose paperwork. I am not going to let anyone take that." Lucy stared at him. Something was happening in her face that she was working very hard to contain. Her mouth pressed tight, her eyes bright and fierce and full of something that had nowhere left to go. "You're going to make me cry," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "And I don't do that." "I know," Jesse said. "You're the toughest person I've ever met." "Stop talking then," she said. But she looked at him for a long beat after that. 3 seconds. 4. With an expression that didn't need any words at all. Clara Morton was watching them both with her hands folded in front of her, and what might have been the beginning of a smile on her face. "Well then," she said, "let's get to work." Ben Caldecott arrived on Thursday afternoon with a worn leather satchel, a 3-day beard, and the particular no-nonsense energy of a man who had been riding hard and was not done yet. He was younger than Jesse remembered, maybe 35, lean through the face, with sharp eyes that moved around a room the way a surveyor's eyes move across land, measuring everything, missing nothing. He shook Jesse's hand once, looked at Lucy for a long moment, and then sat down at Clara's table and opened his satchel without ceremony. "Tell me everything," he said. "In order. Leave nothing out because you think it's small." Jesse told him. Clara filled in the pieces she'd gathered from town. Lucy sat at the corner of the table with her arms on the wood and her chin resting on her arms, and listened to everything without interruption. And Caldecott wrote in a tight, fast hand that covered page after page. When they were done, he set down his pen and looked at his notes. "All right," he said. "Here's what we have. We have a witness transaction in which Hank Briggs offered a minor child for sale in a public establishment. We have Cleet's sworn letter. We have Harlan from the dry goods, who saw the girl's condition upon arrival. We have Pete Dunbar, who was willing to speak to Jesse's character. And we have the complete absence of any documentation establishing Hank Briggs as this child's legal guardian in the first place." He looked up. "Lucy, is Hank Briggs your father?" "No," she said. Caldecott's pen stopped. "He's been claiming parental guardianship." "He's not my father." Her voice was level. "My father left 2 years ago, after my mother died. He just left. Hank was a man my mother knew before she married my father. He showed up after she died and told me I owed him because he'd helped her once.
She paused. I don't know if that's true. Silence dropped over the table, like a stone into still water. Jessie stared at her. Clara stared at her. Caldecott leaned forward very slowly. Lucy, you're telling me Hank Briggs has no blood relation to you whatsoever? No, sir. And your actual father is where? I don't know. He left and didn't come back. Caldecott sat back in his chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back down at his notes and drew a single long line under everything he'd written. Hollis doesn't know this, he said. How could he? Clara asked. He couldn't. He took Hank's word. Caldecott's jaw was set in the way of a man who has just watched the ground shift under a fight he was already planning to win. Hank told him he was her father. Hollis filed on that basis, and nobody checked. He looked at Jessie. This changes everything. Hollis isn't filing a guardianship dispute. He's filing on behalf of a man with no legal standing whatsoever. He closed his satchel. If I can establish that before Judge Harrow tomorrow, this case doesn't just fail. It falls apart entirely. Jessie exhaled through his nose. He felt the knot in his chest loosen by exactly 1 degree. No more than that, because Hollis was still Hollis, and tomorrow was still tomorrow. But 1 degree was more than he'd had this morning. He looked at Lucy, who was watching Caldecott with the focused attention of someone who was not going to celebrate until she understood exactly what the words meant. So, he loses? She said. If I do my job right, Caldecott said. Yes. Lucy turned that over. What if you don't do it right? Caldecott looked at her, surprised for just a moment, then something that might have been respect. Then we fight it on appeal, and then we fight it again, and we keep fighting it until we win. He picked up his pen. But I intend to do it right. Lucy looked at Jessie. Jessie gave her a single nod. She unfolded her arms and sat up straight in the chair and turned back to Caldecott. What do you need from me? They worked until nearly midnight. Caldecott built his arguments the way a man builds a fence, one post at a time, testing each one before moving to the next, going back to reinforce anything that shifted. Clara made coffee and kept it coming, and added her own careful observations from the days she'd spent listening to Hollis work the town. Jessie answered every question Caldecott put to him directly and without elaboration, and Lucy answered hers the same way. At one point, Caldecott asked Lucy to describe, in her own words, what had happened in the saloon. She did it without drama and without hesitation, flat and factual and precise, every detail in order. And Jessie watched Caldecott's expression as she spoke, and saw the lawyer absorb not just the content, but the manner of it. This child, giving testimony with the steadiness of someone who had already decided the truth, was the only weapon worth carrying. When she finished, Caldecott set down his pen. Lucy, he said carefully, I may need you to say some of that tomorrow, in front of the judge. Can you do that? She looked at him. Is that allowed? I'm 11. A judge can hear testimony from a minor if he chooses to. Harrow will choose to. I'll make sure of it. He held her gaze. But only if you want to. I will not ask you to do something you're not willing to do. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been quiet my whole life, she said. I've stayed out of the way and kept my head down, and it didn't help. She looked at Jessie once, then back at Caldecott. I'd rather say the thing. Caldecott nodded. Then we prepare you for it tonight. It was past 11 when Jessie finally walked Caldecott to the door. Clara had taken Lucy to the Hargroves' spare room, safer for everyone, given tomorrow, that Lucy spent the night in town under Clara's roof rather than the mountain. At the door, Caldecott turned. "She's remarkable," he said quietly. "Yeah," Jessie said. "She is." "And you?" Caldecott studied him. "Are you prepared for tomorrow?" "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." Caldecott was quiet for a moment. "Hollis will go after you personally. In that room. He'll say what he's been saying in town, or a version of it, and he'll say it in front of the judge, and he'll say it loudly." He paused. "You need to stay still. Whatever he says, you stay still. You let me answer it. You understand?" Jessie thought about what it had taken to stay still when Pete Dunbar had first told him what Hollis was saying. He thought about the 3 steps he'd walked away before turning back around, and how much of himself had gone into those 3 steps. "I understand," he said. "Jessie," Caldecott's voice dropped, "you need to sleep tonight. Genuinely sleep. Because tomorrow, you're going to need every piece of yourself." Jessie nodded. Caldecott left. Jessie went back inside Clara's empty sitting room and stood alone in it for a moment, and did not sleep for a long time. The courthouse in Copper Creek was a single room attached to the back of the marshal's office, and when Jessie walked in on Friday morning, it was more full than he'd expected. The chairs were filled, not with people he'd have predicted, not just the saloon regulars and the board and the gossiping, but with people he knew. Harlan from the dry goods, Pete Dunbar, who had ridden through the night to be here, 2 women from the church whose names Jessie couldn't quite recall, but whose faces he recognized, the postmaster's wife, who had reportedly heard Hollis's version of events, and whose expression right now suggested she had updated her assessment. Cleet was there. He was sitting in the back with his big arms folded across his chest, and a look on his face that said he had come here to tell the truth, and would like to see someone try to stop him. Jessie found a seat at the front table beside Caldecott. He did not look at Hollis, who was already at the opposing table, with a leather folio open in front of him, and Hank Briggs seated beside him, looking simultaneously smug and nervous. He did not look at Hank Briggs. He looked at Caldecott's notes, and at the door, and when it opened and Clara brought Lucy in, he let himself look at her. She was wearing a clean dress Clara had found somewhere. Her braid was neat. Her chin was up. She walked to the seat Clara guided her to, in the gallery, not at the table. And she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. She caught Jessie's eye once. She nodded. He nodded back. Judge Harrow was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with a gray mustache, and the kind of unhurried authority that came from having done the same thing for 30 years and knowing exactly which parts of it mattered. He entered without ceremony, settled at the bench, and looked at the room over the top of the spectacles. "This is a hearing regarding the guardianship petition filed by Hank Briggs through counsel," he said, looking at his papers. "Mr. Hollis, as petitioner's counsel, you'll present your case first." Hollis stood. He was smooth. Jessie had expected that, had been told to expect it, but smooth was the right word. He built his argument carefully, piece by piece. The concern of a father figure, the unauthorized removal of a minor child, the irregular living situation. He said the word irregular 3 times. He said vulnerable child twice. He did not say the specific thing he'd been saying in town. He was too careful for that in a room with a judge. But he orbited it, close enough that anyone listening could feel its shape. Jessie sat still. He pressed the soles of his boots flat against the floor, and kept his hands relaxed on the table, and did not move while Hollis spoke. Because Caldecott had told him to stay still, and Caldecott was right, and the only thing that made it possible was not looking at Hank Briggs, whose expression had taken on the particular shape of a man who was enjoying himself. When Hollis finished, Harrow looked at Caldecott. Caldecott stood, buttoned his jacket once, and said 4 words before he said anything else. "Your Honor, one foundational question." Harrow looked at him. "Go ahead. Is Hank Briggs the biological father of this child?" Hollis was on his feet. "That's not in dispute." "It is in dispute," Caldecott said, without raising his voice.
"I have a sworn statement from the child herself, made last evening, that Hank Briggs bears no blood relation to her whatsoever. Her biological father, one Thomas Brierly, departed the family home following her mother's death 2 years prior and has not returned." He set a page on the table. "Mr. Briggs represented himself to petitioner's counsel as the girl's father. He is not. He is a former acquaintance of her deceased mother, who assumed informal care of the child without any legal establishment of guardianship, and subsequently attempted to sell her." He set down a second page. "In a saloon, for $20, in front of witnesses." The room shifted. Jessie felt it. A collective intake of something that wasn't quite breath, wasn't quite sound, but was the specific sensation of a room full of people updating their understanding simultaneously. Hollis looked at Hank Briggs. Hank Briggs looked at the floor. Harrow said, "Mr. Hollis, was your client's relation to the child verified before this petition was filed?" A pause that lasted 3 seconds too long. "We relied on, was it verified?" Another pause. "No, Your Honor." The room was very quiet. Harrow wrote something. He looked at Caldecott. "Proceed." Caldecott was methodical and relentless in equal measure. He called Cleet first, who sat in the witness chair and told what he'd seen with a straightforward bluntness that brooked no interpretation. Harlan followed, precise and careful, a merchant's eye for detail. Pete Dunbar spoke briefly and plainly to Jessie's character. Each witness landed like a stone, and the picture they built together was the same one Jessie had lived, except from the outside looking in, which made it somehow worse. Hollis cross-examined each one. He was still good, still smooth, but the ground under his feet had changed, and he knew it. And the smoothness had a strained quality now, like a man performing confidence rather than feeling it. When Caldecott said, "I'd like to call Lucy Brierly," the room went very still. Hollis was on his feet. "Your Honor, the child is old enough to speak for herself," Harrow said, and looked at Lucy. "Young lady, you don't have to say anything. Do you understand that?" Lucy stood from her seat in the gallery. Her voice was clear and steady. "Yes, sir, I understand." "And you want to speak?" "Yes, sir, I do." Harrow gestured toward the chair. She walked to it without hesitation. Straight back, chin level, hands folded in her lap when she sat. And Jessie watched her, and thought about all the things that had happened in 10 days, and what it had cost this child to walk across a room like that, knowing what waited, and do it anyway. Caldecott kept his questions simple. How she'd come to be in the saloon. What Hank Briggs had said. What had happened after. She answered each one in the same flat, precise way she'd answered them the night before. No drama, no performance, just the truth, told plainly by someone who had decided the truth was all she had worth giving. Then Hollis stood to cross-examine. He opened gently, carefully. He asked about her age, her schooling, her understanding of legal proceedings. Lucy answered him with the same steady directness she'd given Caldecott. Jessie's hands were pressed flat on the table. Then Hollis said, "Lucy, the man you're living with on the mountain, Jesse Caldwell. He's a stranger to you, isn't that right?" Something in the room tightened. Lucy looked at Hollis. "He was," she said. "He was a stranger 10 days ago," Hollis pressed.
And now you're living alone with him on an isolated mountain property. Can you tell the court why you believe that's an appropriate situation for a child your age?" It was the question he'd been building toward. Jesse could feel it land. He kept his hands flat. He did not move. Lucy looked at Hollis for a long moment with those pale gray eyes. Then she said, "Because he's the first person in 2 years who asked what I wanted before deciding what was going to happen to me." The room went completely silent. Hollis opened his mouth. Lucy continued, and her voice didn't waver by a single thread. "Hank Briggs never asked what I wanted. The 2 men in the saloon never asked what I wanted. You're not asking what I want right now. You're asking questions you think will make the judge think something that isn't true." She looked at him with the particular exhausted steadiness of someone who had run out of patience for being managed. "Jesse Caldwell asked me. Every time. Before he did anything, he asked." Hollis was perfectly still. Harrow was watching Lucy over his spectacles. Jesse could hear his own heartbeat. "Nothing further," Hollis said, and sat down. Harrow deliberated for 11 minutes. Jesse knew because he counted, not the seconds, but the pressure of each one stacking up in the room while Caldecott sat with his hands folded and Hollis stared at his folio, and Hank Briggs picked at a loose thread on his cuff, and the gallery sat in the particular hushed expectation of people who have already decided what they believe and are waiting to see if justice agrees with them. Lucy sat beside Clara in the gallery. Clara had her hand over Lucy's on the bench seat, and Lucy wasn't pulling away from it. Jesse looked at that and had to look somewhere else. When Harrow came back, the room reorganized itself instantly, straightening, stilling. Harrow sat. He looked at his papers. He looked up. "The petition for guardianship filed by Hank Briggs is denied," he said, "on multiple grounds, beginning with the fundamental one that the petitioner has no established legal relationship to the minor child and misrepresented himself to counsel and to this court. That misrepresentation alone would be sufficient to dismiss the matter." Hollis's face was composed and unreadable. Hank Briggs looked like a man who had just watched a hand he'd stacked disappear from the table. "Furthermore," Harrow said, and his voice took on a particular weight, "this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented regarding the events in the Copper Creek saloon." He looked at Hank Briggs directly for the first time. "Mr. Briggs, you are not this child's guardian. You were never this child's guardian, and the transaction described in testimony today will be referred to the Territorial Marshal's office for review." He set down his papers. "Are we clear?" Hank Briggs did not answer. He was looking somewhere in the middle distance, the smug expression entirely gone. "Mr. Caldecott," Harrow continued, "I would strongly recommend you and your client initiate a formal petition for guardianship through the proper territorial channels as soon as possible, in order to establish legal clarity going forward." He paused. "Is Mr. Caldwell prepared to pursue that?" Caldecott was on his feet. "He is, Your Honor." Harrow looked at Jesse for the first time directly. It was a brief look, measured, without warmth or coldness, just a plain, honest assessment. Then he gave a single nod. "This hearing is closed," he said, and stood. The room exhaled all at once. Jesse sat for a moment without moving. Then Caldecott was gripping his shoulder and saying something Jesse wasn't quite hearing. And people in the gallery were standing, and somewhere behind him, Pete Dunbar said something short and satisfied that might have been a laugh. He turned around. Lucy was already out of her seat, pushing past the gallery chairs, and she crossed the space between them with a directness that was entirely hers. No hesitation, no holding back. And Jesse caught her when she got to him, one hand on her shoulder and one on the back of her head, and she pressed her face against his chest and stayed there. She didn't cry. He'd have bet money on that. But she held on, And Jesse Caldwell, who had spent 3 years turning himself into a man who didn't need anything, stood in the middle of that courtroom with his arms around an 11-year-old girl who had called him by her own actions and her own words, something no legal document had established yet, and felt the door that he'd been holding shut for 3 years move on its hinges one final time. This time he let it. He pressed his hand against the back of her head and closed his eyes and let it open. It was Clara Morton who finally said, quietly, from a few feet away, "Well,
What do we do now?" Jesse kept his eyes closed for one more second. Then he opened them. Lucy pulled back from his chest and looked up at him. Those pale gray eyes, full and fierce and stubbornly dry. And Jesse looked back at her and thought about the photograph between the almanac and the candles. He thought about 2 graves in frozen ground and 3 years of getting up every morning for no particular reason. He thought about $20 laid on a saloon table for a girl who'd stood beside Hank Briggs's chair with her eyes fixed on the floor. "We go home," Jesse said. Lucy held his gaze for one long moment. Then she stepped back, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the door. They rode back up the mountain in the long afternoon light, Lucy sitting in front of Jesse the same way she had 10 days ago on the same trail. But nothing else was the same. 10 days ago, she'd had both hands white-knuckled on the saddle horn and her shoulders drawn up to her ears, and 3 feet of invisible wire strung between her body and his. Now she was sitting easy, one hand resting on the horn out of habit more than fear. And when Crow stepped around a switchback and she tilted with the horse's movement, she didn't correct away from Jesse. She just moved with it. Jesse noticed. He didn't say anything. He just held the reins a little looser and let Crow set his own pace. They were halfway up when Lucy said, "Caldecott said formal guardianship takes how long?" "Few weeks, maybe a month. There's paperwork that has to go through the territorial office." "And until then?" "Until then, you're with me. And anybody who wants to argue that can take it up with Judge Harrow." He paused. "Which they won't." She was quiet for a moment. "What if my actual father shows up?" Jesse's hands tightened just slightly on the reins. He'd thought about that. He'd thought about it at 2 in the morning for the past 3 nights, turning it over in the dark the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under. "Then we deal with it," he said. "Same way we dealt with Hollis. Same way we dealt with today." "Together?" The word landed simply, without weight or plea. Just a question, an honest one. "Together," Jesse said. Lucy turned her head slightly toward the trail ahead. "Okay," she said. One word. But she settled back an inch, and the inch was everything. The cabin looked the same as it always did. It always would. Rough log walls, covered porch, woodpile taller than either of them. But Lucy went up the porch steps without testing them first, and she pushed the door open without hesitating in the threshold, and she walked inside and dropped onto the bench by the table, like a person who had come home after a long day. Jesse came in behind her, set his hat on the peg, and stood in the middle of the room and looked at her sitting there. She caught him looking. "What?" "Nothing. You're doing that thing where you look at me like I'm about to disappear." His mouth twitched. "Am I?" "You've done it about 6 times in the past 2 days. I've been counting." "Occupational habit," he said. "When you've lost things, you count what's still there." She looked at him with those pale gray eyes, steady, direct, and something moved through her face that she let stay visible this time, instead of pulling back from it. "I'm still here," she said. "I know. I'm going to keep being here." Jesse pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. He put his elbows on the table
and looked at her directly, the way he'd learned she preferred. Not around her, not above her, but straight at her. "I know that too," he said. She reached out and put both hands flat on the table, a gesture so deliberate and rare for her that he went still, watching it. She looked at her own hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "I want to learn to read weather," she said, "like Sarah could." His breath caught. He held it a beat. Then he let it out slow. "Yeah? You said she could read a sky and know what it was going to do by nightfall." She lifted her chin slightly. "I want to learn that." Jesse looked at this girl, this child who had come to him with nothing but a bruised jaw and a broken braid and a 1,000-yard stare, who had in 10 days become the person who handed him tools without being asked, and talked back to a lawyer in a courtroom, and asked for what she wanted plainly and without apology. "I'll teach you," he said. "First clear morning." She nodded. And then, very quietly, so quietly he almost missed it, "I think she'd be glad that I'm here." Jesse's jaw tightened against itself. "Yeah," he managed. "I think she'd be real glad." Lucy took her hands off the table and stood up. "I'll start supper," she said, matter of fact. Done with the soft part. Moving forward, the way she always moved forward. Jesse watched her go to the shelf and start pulling things down, and he sat at the table and breathed in and breathed out, and thought that the world had a way of giving back what it took from you. Not the same thing, never the same thing, but something that fit the empty shape. Something that needed the room. 3 days later, Clara Morton rode up the mountain. Jesse heard crows greeting Winnie from the pasture and came out of the cabin to find her dismounting at the post with a particular brisk purposefulness that seemed to be her natural resting state. Lucy came out behind him and looked at Clara with the wariness she still defaulted to for people outside their two-person orbit, less sharp than it had been, but present. Then Clara held out a brown paper parcel tied with string and said, "Books. Harlan had them in the back. I thought you might want them." Lucy took the parcel and looked down at it. Then she looked up at Clara. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Clara looked at Jesse. "Can we talk?" They sat on the porch. Lucy took her books inside, and Jesse could hear the paper unwrapping through the open door as Clara settled into the single chair, and Jesse leaned against the post and waited. "Caldecott filed the formal guardianship petition this morning," Clara said. "Harrow is expediting it. He thinks 4 weeks, maybe less." "Good," Jesse said. "There's something else." Clara's voice shifted, not alarmed, but careful in a way that made Jesse's attention sharpen. "Hank Briggs left town." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Yesterday morning, before dawn. Harlan saw him loading a mule." She paused. "He left owing money to 3 people and didn't say goodbye to anyone." Jesse breathed. "Good riddance." "Probably." Clara looked at her hands, then back up at him. "But Caldecott says the territorial marshal may want to question him before too long. The referral Harrow made is moving." She met Jesse's eyes. "Hollis, too. Harrow apparently put something in writing to the territorial circuit about Hollis's arrangement in Silver Falls. Whatever string Hollis had in that court, Harrow cut it." Jesse stared at her. "He did that on his own?" Apparently the hearing on Friday gave him what he needed to do it formally. He'd been waiting for the right moment. Clara's expression was precise and satisfied in equal measure. Lucy gave him the moment. Jesse turned that over. He thought about a heavy-set man in his 60s with a gray mustache, looking over spectacles at an 11-year-old girl who had told a lawyer in plain terms that he wasn't asking the right questions. He thought about 11 minutes of deliberation that had done more than settle one hearing. "She doesn't know that," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "I thought you might want to tell her yourself." Jesse looked through the open door. He could see the edge of the table and one of Lucy's arms, and the spread of a book open across the tabletop. Her head bent over it, still and focused. The particular silence of a person who has found the thing they needed and gone quiet inside it. "Yeah," he said. "I will." Clara stood to leave. She gathered her reins and then paused with one foot in the stirrup. "Jesse." She looked at him over the horse's back.
"She's going to be all right. You know that."
"I do," he said. "So are you." He looked at her. Clara Morton had sharp eyes and no patience for soft-pedaling, and she said the thing directly without apology, and there was something about that quality that Jesse recognized and respected. "Working on it," he said. Clara gave him a look that was not unsympathetic. Then she swung up and rode. He told Lucy that evening. He did it simply, the way he'd learned she needed things, without softening the edges into something unrecognizable. He told her what Harrow had done, and what the referral meant for Hollis, and why it mattered. He told her that what she had said in that courtroom had given a judge who'd been waiting for leverage exactly the leverage he needed. She listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, looking at the fire. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "So Hollis might actually lose something," she said. "Looks that way." "Because of what I said." "Because of what you said." She stared at the fire. "I just told the truth." "That's usually all it takes," Jesse said, "when someone's actually listening." Another silence. "Do you think Hank will come back?" Jesse considered the honest answer. "No. A man like Hank goes somewhere the debt isn't waiting for him. He won't come back here."
"And my father, my real father." She stopped.
"If he comes back," Jesse said, "he'll find a judge's order, a lawyer's name, and a man who isn't moving." He kept his voice even. "He walked away, Lucy. Whatever else is true about Thomas Brierly, he walked away when you needed him. That tells you everything about whether he's coming back." Her jaw was tight. She breathed out slowly through her nose. "It doesn't make me not sad about it." "No," Jesse said quietly. "It doesn't. And you're allowed to be sad about it. You're allowed to be sad about your mother and your father and everything that happened before you walked into that cabin. None of that goes away just because things are better now." She looked up at him. "Did you ever stop being sad about Sarah and Clara?" "No," he said. "I told you. It just stops taking up all the room." "Has it? For you? Now?" He thought about that the way it deserved to be thought about, honestly, without flinching. "It's starting to," he said. "For the first time in a long time." "Yeah." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the fire and unclenched her jaw and let her shoulders drop by about an inch, which for Lucy Brierly was the equivalent of another person sobbing. "Good," she said. The formal paperwork arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the hearing. Pete Dunbar's boy brought it up again, same as before, same trade of an errand for dried venison, and Jesse opened it at the kitchen table, while Lucy sat across from him eating her breakfast and watching him with the intense, carefully controlled attention she brought to anything that mattered. He read through it. He read through it again. Then he set it down and looked across the table at Lucy. "It's done," he said. She set down her fork. "Done? Done. Judge Harrow signed it himself." Jesse turned the papers toward her so she could see. "Legal guardianship, established and recorded in the territorial office." Lucy looked at the papers. She looked at the signature. She looked at the date. She looked at Jesse's name in the careful official print that turned it into something permanent, something that existed beyond this mountain and this cabin and the two of them sitting at this table. She pressed her lips together very hard. "Don't," Jesse said, and there was a warmth in his voice that he didn't try to hide. "Go ahead." "I'm not going to cry," she said, but her voice had gone thick at the edges. "I know you're not. I just—" She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, breathed in hard through her nose. "It's just paper," she said. "It's not just paper." "I know it's not just paper." And then, fast and furious, 2 tears escaped down her face before she could stop them, and she wiped them away with the heel of her hand with such aggressive efficiency that Jesse almost laughed, except that his own throat was doing something complicated, and laughing wasn't available to him just at that moment either. "Come here," he said. She came around the table, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she pressed her face against his arm. Not clinging, not collapsing, just leaning, the way a person leans against something they've decided to trust. And they stood there for a moment, in the kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, with the papers on the table and the morning light coming in through the open door. And Jesse held on to this child who had cost him $20 and given him back everything. He pressed his mouth against the top of her head and closed his eyes. "We're okay," he said. "You hear me? We're okay." She nodded against his arm, didn't speak. They stayed like that for a while. She read weather for the first time on a Saturday. They were out by the fence line, the same fence where she'd first handed him a tool without being asked. And she'd been watching the sky for 20 minutes with the focused stillness she brought to things she was learning, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over a stone in her palm. Jesse was working. He was letting her think. Then she said, "Storm by nightfall, coming from the northwest. Rain first, then something colder." Jesse stopped working and looked at the sky. He looked at it the way Sarah used to look at it, reading the layers, the texture, the color at the edges where the blue went greenish and flat. He looked back at Lucy. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face, pure, unguarded, the expression of someone who did not yet know how to be cool about a thing before they'd felt it fully, was so much like Clara, at 4 years old, announcing an opinion that Jesse's chest seized. "How'd I do it?" she asked. "You paid attention," he said. "That's all it ever was. Sarah said the same thing every time I asked her. She said most people don't read the sky because they're not actually looking at it. They're looking past it." He held her gaze. "You looked at it." Lucy looked back up at the sky. Then she looked at Jesse. "She really would have liked me," she said. Not a question this time, a statement. "She really would have," Jesse confirmed. Lucy turned back to the fence line and picked up the tool from the ground where he'd set it. "Show me the next post," she said. He showed her the next post. She worked beside him without being told what to do, handing things over before he reached for them, asking questions when she needed to, and not asking when she didn't. The storm she'd read came in exactly the way she'd said it would. Rain first, then cold, and they made it back to the cabin 2 minutes before the first drops hit. She was already at the stove by the time Jesse shook the rain off his hat. "Biscuits?" she asked. "Biscuits," he agreed. She started measuring flour with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 20 times, and Jesse hung up his coat and watched her work, and thought about a man with clean hands in a hotel dining room who had said 7 days, as if 7 days were a countdown to something ending. He'd been wrong. 7 days had been a countdown to something beginning. The last thing happened 6 weeks after the hearing, on an ordinary afternoon when nothing about the day had suggested it was coming. Lucy had been on the porch when Jesse came back from the pasture, sitting in the chair with her book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. She was looking at the trail down the mountain with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not afraid, not the old, trapped stillness. Something else. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her. "You all right?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something." "Okay." She closed the book in her lap. "My mother named me Lucy because she said it meant light." She paused. "My father told me once that was a stupid reason to name somebody." She paused again. "I believed him for a long time." Jessie sat down on the edge of the porch boards and looked at her. He didn't rush her. "I don't believe him anymore," she said. She said it simply, plainly. The way she said things she had thought through fully and decided were true. "I think my mother was right." Jessie was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your mother was right." Lucy looked at him. "How do you know? You never met her." "Because she raised you," he said. "And you're the most light I've had in this place in 3 years. So I'd say she knew exactly what she was doing when she named you." Lucy stared at him. He'd surprised her. He could see it in her face, the momentary crack in the careful composure, the flicker of something open and unguarded. She looked away fast. Looked back. Her chin was doing that particular stubborn thing it did when she was fighting herself. "Stop saying things like that," she said. "Why?" "Because it makes it hard to be stoic." He almost laughed. Almost. "You don't have to be stoic, Lucy. Not here. Not with me." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon was cooling. Somewhere down the ridge, a hawk was making slow circles on the thermals. Crow was moving in the pasture, and the sound of the grass under his feet was the only sound between them. Then Lucy Brierly put her book on the porch boards, pulled her knees to her chest, and leaned her head against Jessie Caldwell's shoulder. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. He put one hand briefly against the top of her head, same as the day in the courtroom, and then he let his arm rest along the porch rail and looked out over the mountain that had been his whole world for 3 years. This hard and beautiful place where he'd come to disappear. And felt it be something different now. Something that had an inside and an outside. Something you came home to. He didn't know what the next year looked like. He didn't know about lawyers and territorial offices, and what happened when a girl with no family on record grew up on a mountain. He didn't know about the 100 ordinary problems waiting in the road ahead, school and towns, and the world below this ridge that was going to keep being the world no matter how far up the mountain you went. He knew he'd figure it out, the same way he'd figured out the last 6 weeks. One day, one choice, one true thing at a time. He knew that Lucy Brierly was going to be fierce and difficult and honest and occasionally infuriating, and that she was going to read weather better than most men twice her age, and that she was going to be fine. Not because the world had suddenly decided to be kind to her, but because she had decided, in spite of everything it had done to her, to be stronger than it. He knew that $20 had been the best thing he'd ever spent, and he knew, with the simple, unshakable certainty of a man who had finally stopped running from the one thing that could save him, that Jessie Caldwell, mountain cowboy, loner, man who had buried his whole heart in frozen ground and built a wall around what was left, was not alone anymore. He had come down off this mountain broken and gone back up whole. And the difference between those two things was sitting right beside him with her head on his shoulder and a book on the porch boards and 3 years of hard weather written into her face. And she was his, and he was hers. And nothing in this world or the next was ever going to change that.